Listen to part of a university lecture on the matter of Britain by a professor of literature. Today, we're going to start on the matter of Britain, and the core of the matter of Britain is, of course, the stories of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. I'm sure you're all familiar with the basic cast of characters: King Arthur and Queen Guinevere, their evil nephew Mordred, Merlin the magician, Sir Lancelot, Sir Gawain, Sir Galahad, and the hunt for the Holy Grail, and so forth. Anyway, some of you may think that King Arthur, shorn of some of these tales, of course, was a real historical personage, and others of you probably think he was just a legend. But the truth is, nobody knows the truth. The real King Arthur, if he was real, probably lived during the 5th century AD as a Roman Celtic leader who fought against the invading Anglo-Saxons. However, this was long before any reliable records of English history came into existence. Arthur is never mentioned by name in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which dates from the late 9th century, and he's not mentioned in Bede's Ecclesiastical History from the 8th century, and he doesn't appear in any other manuscript between 400 and 850 AD, even though some of them do record the Battle of Mount Badon between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons, which was a very real event, a major political victory at the end of the 5th century, which later writers insist Arthur participated in. The first texts that mention him are the Historia Britanniae, which is a Latin history compiled by Nennius in the late 9th century, and also the Annales Cambria, the Welsh annals written in the 10th century. Both of these mention Arthur's part in the Battle of Mount Badon, though he was not called a king. But these texts were written at least 400 years after the event, and this is as much as we actually know about the historical Arthur. It's with Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, written much later in 1138, that the legend of King Arthur really took off. Geoffrey created an imaginative, full-blown narrative of Arthur as King of Britain, who defeated the Anglo-Saxons, and then established his wonderful empire over Britain, Ireland, Iceland, and Gaul. Geoffrey also created Merlin the magician, Arthur's sword Excalibur, and most of the other elements and incidents that are still a fundamental part of the legend. Geoffrey's history became immensely popular in Britain, and then it spread to the continent, where it was picked up by a greater writer, the French poet Chrétien de Troyes, who added Sir Lancelot and the quest for the Holy Grail. Chrétien wrote several Arthurian romances between 1170 and 1190, and it was these that had the greatest influence on both the spread of Arthur's legend and the elaboration of the medieval romance, the vehicle that became so closely associated with this kind of story of chivalry. These sort of romances remained very popular all through the Middle Ages, and the culmination of the development of the medieval Arthurian romance cycle was Thomas Malory's 15th century Le Morte d'Arthur, which is a retelling of the whole set of incidents and adventures in a single English work. Le Morte d'Arthur was one of the earliest books printed by William Caxton in 1485. So Malory's romance was disseminated very widely and very quickly, and essentially all later works on Arthur and his knights were derived from Malory's compendium. The most popular current theory is that the Arthurian legend is ultimately derived from Celtic mythology. Traditional Welsh, Cornish, and Irish heroic tales, which include elements of essentially all of Arthur's doings. These tales probably mixed together, and the resilient hero, Arthur, was then carried to the continent with the Norman armies. By 1100 AD, the tales had reached as far as Italy. But social changes and the Renaissance brought the end of the medieval period, and the people lost interest in the romance of chivalry. The printing of Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur in 1634 was the last one for 200 years. Finally, in the early 19th century, The literary revival of Romanticism, of medievalism, of the idea of chivalry, revived the Arthur legend again. Le Morte Arthur was finally reprinted in 1816. William Wordsworth wrote The Egyptian Maid, the story of a young girl brought to Arthur's court in 1835. And then Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote his immensely popular Idylls of the King in 1859. Idylls of the King put a Victorian veneer onto the entire Arthur narrative. Now, I'd like you to read over these passages that I'm handing out, some excerpts from both Malory's Morte Arthur and Tennyson's Idylls of the King, and then please be ready to contrast and compare them in Friday's class. And feel free to read more of each of them if you have time. Both are available on the internet.